In the heart of Versailles, beneath the gold-leaf ceilings and whispering silk, a queen once sat motionless on a throne of velvet. Her rouge-painted cheeks glowed with an artificial vitality, but her breath was shallow, her bones aching from a disease no physician dared to name aloud. Around her, courtiers smiled and bowed, drowning in perfume to mask the smell of rot. She was a vision of splendor, but inside, her body was quietly unraveling. This was the cruel irony of Europe's most powerful queens. They were the center of empire, yet helpless, prisoners of their own flesh. Hidden behind powdered wigs and layers of brocade were secret torments, diseases hushed in royal corridors, whispered about only when the candles were low and the physicians had drunk enough wine to forget their oaths. These were not just ailments of the body, but afflictions of politics, pride, and patriarchy. Take, for instance, Queen Mary, the First of England, Bloody Mary, they called her. But few remember that her reign was haunted by phantom pregnancies. Her belly would swell, her appetite would shift, and her court would prepare for a royal heir. Yet again and again, no child came. Physicians poked and prodded, whispering of divine punishment or witchcraft. But today, historians suggest a more earthly culprit, a likely mix of ovarian cysts or uterine cancer conditions invisible to 16th century medicine. Mary's body betrayed her not just biologically, but politically. A queen who could not bear a child was a queen on the edge of irrelevance, and Mary knew it. Each false pregnancy wasn't just a medical episode, it was a national crisis. Further east, in the glittering imperial court of Habsburg Spain, a young empress named Elizabeth of Valois bore the weight of 2 crowns and a body riddled with tuberculosis. At just 14, she was married off to a man 20 years, her senior, her own step-uncle, expected to produce heirs immediately. But the cough came first, then the weight loss, and then the blood. She smiled through bleeding gums and fevers, her face powdered to hide the purpling beneath her eyes. Physicians blamed melancholia, but what they couldn't diagnose, they couldn't treat. At 23, she died in agony, her lungs likely liquefied by disease. Officially, she died of a miscarriage. Unofficially, she wasted away under the crushing expectations of a dynasty obsessed with heirs and appearances. But no tale of royal suffering is quite as grotesque, as tragic as that of Tsarina Alexandra Feodorovna of Russia. Her story begins not in sickness, but in love for her hemophiliac son, Alexei. Hemophilia, the so-called royal disease, had wormed its way into the Russian court through Alexandra's grandmother, Queen Victoria of England. Victoria was a genetic carrier, and through her daughters and granddaughters, the mutation spread like a curse across Europe's thrones. In Alexandra's case, the cost was unbearable. Alexei's slightest bump could lead to internal bleeding. His screams echoed through the marble halls of the Winter Palace. While Alexandra prayed herself hoarse in candlelit chapels, she turned to Rasputin, the so-called mad monk, whose dark influence over the royal family would hasten the empire's collapse. But beneath the scandal and politics, the truth was brutal. The Tsarina's body had passed on a death sentence to her child, and she knew it. Syphilis, too, lurked like a ghost in many royal bedrooms. French Queen Isabeau of Bavaria was long rumored to suffer from it. Though records are murky, some accounts describe symptoms eerily familiar: ulcers, cognitive decline, paranoia. Whether true or not, the rumors stuck proof of how disease and scandal fed each other in royal courts. But there was one case where the infection was undeniable. Queen Maria, the First of Portugal. Her reign began with promise, but ended in madness. She would shriek in the night, tear at her gowns, and see ghosts in broad daylight. Doctors blamed hysteria and religious mania, but the autopsy years later told a different story: signs of advanced syphilis that had eaten away at her brain. Her courtiers, desperate to protect the monarchy's image, confined her to a convent, where she screamed into the silence for years. Even seemingly untouchable icons like Queen Victoria herself were not immune to biological tragedy. She bore 9 children, many of them carriers of hemophilia. Though she escaped the disease's physical toll, she passed its shadow on 2 generations. The genetic mutation she carried would devastate families from Spain to Prussia to Russia. Her descendants, born into golden cradles, were buried young or forced to watch their children die in slow blood-soaked silence. The disease was not hers, and yet entirely hers. Queen Anne of Great Britain, meanwhile, is a haunting example of reproductive horror masked as royal failure. In her lifetime, she was pregnant 17 times. 17. Of those, only 5 resulted in live births. Of those 5, Only one child, William, Duke of Gloucester, survived infancy, and even he died before the age of 12. Anne's body was ravaged by lupus, or possibly a form of Hughes syndrome, an autoimmune condition that caused repeated miscarriages and stillbirth. But in her time, the blame wasn't medical. Anne was viewed as weak, cursed, perhaps even sinful. She waddled through court in constant pain, her joints swollen, her heart broken, each birth a political event, each loss a silent national mourning. There were no private afflictions for these queens. Their bodies were battleground sites of political negotiation, religious anxiety, and public fascination, and often the cures were as horrific as the diseases themselves. Take Catherine de' Medici of France, who in desperation for a male heir, reportedly turned to alchemists and astrologers. Some tales even speak of consuming potions made from powdered unicorn horn, or sleeping under blood-soaked sheets. Whether myth or fact, the desperation was real. The pressure to produce, to survive, to rule, these were not just spiritual burdens. They were medical catastrophes waiting to happen. Even in the most modern courts, the silence around female suffering was deafening. Queen Charlotte, wife of King George III, is believed by some scholars to have suffered from porphyria, a rare genetic disorder that may also have affected her husband. Her symptoms: abdominal pain, anxiety, vomiting, hallucinations. Yet she was expected to keep smiling through concerts, balls, and royal audiences, while her body screamed in protest. There were no diagnoses, no treatments, only leeches, hot irons, and whispered prayers. What ties these queens together is not just disease but secrecy. Their ailments were hidden, misdiagnosed, or deliberately erased from history. Because to admit a queen was sick, truly sick, was to admit weakness at the top of the food chain. So symptoms were cloaked in euphemism. Miscarriages became melancholia. Bleeding became delicate conditions. Madness became spiritual reflection. The body politic could not afford a diseased fever, so the truth was buried, sometimes with the queen herself. Even the palace walls seemed complicit. They absorbed the scent of gangrene and they echoed with the cries of childbirth gone wrong and the mutterings of fevered minds. The corridors, lined with tapestries and secrets, bore witness to royal bodies that decayed behind a veneer of perfection. And so, behind every royal portrait with a serene gaze and immaculate posture, behind every oil painting of queens clad in ermine and lace, there is a hidden history of blood, pus, and pain. Their crowns did not spare them the torment of disease. In many cases, it made it worse, isolating them, silencing them, embalming their suffering in myths of dignity and grace. But history remembers, and when you peel back the layers of silk and ceremony, you find not just women but warriors, silent sufferers in corsets of expectation. And if you listen closely, past the rustling of gowns and the clinking of goblets, you might hear it still, that quiet, terrible truth. Power does not protect the body, not even when it wears a crown.